What is Laconic Wit? I'm so glad you asked. So, back in the day, back in ancient times, the ability to speak and to communicate well was extremely important. We can argue that communication skills are important today, but I don't know that communication skills have the same social importance that they did in previous times. They probably do in certain circles, but I think a lot of people can get through life with really poor communication skills. I don't think that's not progress. But if you read a lot of old texts, there were certain things that set people apart, and one of those was the ability to be able to express their ideas clearly. Now, different cultures looked at this slightly different ways. Even if you go back pretty far, like back to like Homeric legend, when Odysseus and Menelaus visited Troy to sort of plead Menelaus's case to the Trojans to get Helen and Menelaus's wealth back, the Trojans were not impressed with Odysseus's appearance. I don't think they really knew who he was when he showed up. But as soon as he started to speak, he had their attention. They were all like, no one forgot Odysseus. He made a big impression on them by his ability to communicate. Now, in a later period, we had the rise of Athens and we had the rise of Sparta. As you probably know, Sparta and Athens had very different cultures. They're both Greek, but they had different cultures. They had different social systems, a lot of differences. We're not going to get into all that today. I've written about that a lot in other places. But in Athens, they had what they called Attic wit, because their region was known as Attica. And in Sparta, they had Laconic wit, because their region was Lacedaemonia. I probably screwed that up. And in Athens, and I think most of the Greek city states, what was considered really good as far as oratory skills was the ability to eloquently express an idea and to do that very thoroughly. So if someone got up to speak, they would present the whole idea in a lot of detail. In Sparta, I think that the ability to express ideas was also very important, but their approach was different. They liked things to be concise, and they often threw a lot of humor into things. So, Laconic Wit, I'm going to tell you two quick stories and then we'll tie this up. The first one, and both these are pretty well known. I'm guessing at least one of them you've probably heard of, even if you've never read anything from back in the day. If you look up Laconic Wit or like sayings of Spartans, you'll find a bunch of interesting little quippy things that were written down. At one point, some people went to visit the Spartan Senate because they needed their help. They went and they presented their case, and when they were done, the Spartans replied that by the time they were done talking, they forgot what they were talking about. I've read a couple different sort of ways this sort of passed, but basically, the people came back with an empty sack, and they said the sack needs flour. Apparently, the Spartans said you didn't need to say sack, but the point was just simply that, the Spartans could see the sack. They didn't need the people petitioning them to say anything about the sack. They just needed to know that they wanted some flour for the sack. Ultimately, the Spartans agreed to help them, and they went on. The other story that's pretty well known, and if you've seen 300, you might have seen this, but they didn't really do it. I don't even remember how they did it in the film. I just remember that they didn't do it the way I would have. All respect to Frank Miller, and I did enjoy that film. The story is that when these Spartans were making their way towards Thermopylae to have their standoff with Persia, at some point they came across a merchant. They were talking to the merchant, and the merchant asked them, where they were going, because you had 300 Spartan soldiers, and they had a whole bunch of helots with them. And I think there were actually between 5 and 7,000 Greeks at Thermopylae. It wasn't just the 300 Spartans. The 300 Spartans were the ones that held the pass. They stayed, and most everyone else left. But at the beginning of the 3 day battle, it wasn't just them. Anyway, that's something important right now. The Spartans had a conversation with a merchant. The merchant found out what they were doing, and he was afraid for them. He said, you can't fight the Persians. Their army is huge. He told them they have so many arrows it blocks out the sun. And one of the Spartans, Dionekies, he looked at the merchant and he said, "Oh, that's good news. We'll have our battle in the shade." That's Laconic Wit. If you want to apply that in your own life, It's concise. It's not rude. There's a little bit of humor in it. It's deadpan. It's not Jim Carrey. Both those stories can be read about in the histories by Herodotus if you're really curious. It's big, but it's quite good. I'll put a link in the description. That's all for today. Go read a book.